There is no human, no angel, no jinn that wouldn't grasp at the chance to fulfill their deepest longings.
People would be petitioning, evoking jinns to lead the individual to wealth.
We have murders in New York without benefit of ghouls and goblins.
You're a long way from New York, Constable.
The important thing that we have to return to is the term kind of jinn and the term fairy. These are very much catch-all terms.
Do not play with forces you don't understand, or you will suffer the consequences.
And then labs is basically a state where the jinn permanently resides in the human body and will not leave unless it's done by force.
Goblin King, wherever you may be, take this child of mine far away from me!
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural.
Throughout human history, myths and legends have served as our desperate attempt to explain the inexplicable. Among these, the tales of the Fae and the Jinn stand out, not as mere bedtime stories, but as the persistent echoes of something older, something that lingers just beyond the veil of our understanding. The Fae, those elusive inhabitants of the Celtic folklore tradition, are often described as beautiful yet perilous. They seduce with their otherworldly allure, but their gifts can come with curse. And we have the Jinn emerging from the sands of Arabian folklore are no less enigmatic. Capable of granting wishes? Sure, that exists. But often twisting them into cruel ironies. Both are creatures of duality, tricksters, teachers, guardians, and destroyers. But here's the thing that bothers me. It's the similarities. The Fae and the Jinn, despite originating in cultures separated by oceans and desert, share a haunting symmetry. Both are said to dwell in liminal spaces, neither fully of our world nor entirely apart from it. The Fae dance in moonlit glades and hollow hills. The Jinn hide in the shadows of ruined palaces and forgotten temples. Both can appear at will and defy natural laws, and seem to know our deepest desire. And then there are the rules. Sometimes the myth holds that to summon a jinn, one must utter precise words, often with a binding sigil or some kind of offering. To invite a fae, there may be some ancient rites you have to honor, stepping widdershins around a fairy ring, for instance, or leaving an offering of milk and honey. Break the rules, and you may never return from their world. Coincidence? Maybe. But history has taught me not to trust coincidences. What if these entities, these Fae or Jinn, are not merely reflections of cultural imagination? What if they're the same beings, wearing different masks? Or perhaps, what if they are archetypes, a universal force that humanity has always known, yet cannot fully comprehend? Perhaps they are interdimensional travelers slipping between worlds in ways our science has yet to decode. Perhaps they are echoes of an ancient intelligence, fragmented across human mythologies. Or perhaps they are the shadows of our own desires and fears, given form by the Jungian collective unconsciousness. Whatever the answer, one thing is certain. Their stories have endured for millennia, not because they are fanciful, but because they resonate. They remind us that the boundaries between reality and the unknown are thin, perilously thin. Perhaps next time you hear a whisper in the woods or feel an unexplainable chill in the desert air, ask yourself, is it the Fae? Is it the Jinn? Or is it something that defies all our names for it? In nearly every corner of the world, myths of supernatural beings have endured through the centuries. Stories of creatures that defy explanation, slipping between the shadows of what we understand and what we fear. Among them are two ancient entities. One from the scorching deserts of the cradle of civilization, the other from the mist-laden lands of the Emerald Isles. The Jinn, born of smokeless fire, and the Fae, elusive spirits of the earth. But in a world ruled by science and reason, can such stories hold any truth? Could there be something more to these legends than mere imagination? In this episode, we'll explore the thin line between reality and myth, where creatures like the Djinn and Fae may still lurk, waiting for us to believe. Our guest is the seeker of the unseen, the photographer of shadows, and walker between worlds. Darragh Mason, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's really lovely to be here.
Let's start with the Jinn. Can you explain to me the origins of these beings from Arabic folklore?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned in your intro, they're said to be born of smokeless fire. So they are one of the three sapient beings that Allah is said to have created. I should say that while they do turn up in Islamic tradition, indeed in the Quran, these beings and belief in these beings certainly predates Islam by a significant margin. Indeed, you could track some of these beings back to kind of essentially Babylonian kind of wind demons or wind storm entities of some description, but they've been kind of amalgamated into Islam in that kind of catch-all term of Jinn. But going back to my earlier point, they are one of the three sapient beings created by Allah within the Quran. Those being angels or malak, which are created from light. Human beings, which are created from sounding clay, and the Jinn, which are said to be created by smokeless fire. And they're similar to human beings in the sense that they have free will, which angels do not have within the Islamic belief system. They are they're associated with really kind of all that is ill or to be feared within the Islamic world and more broadly within the Arabic world. And belief in the Jinn really stretches across the entire Islamic world, from Indonesia right across to the northwestern Africa, of like lands like Morocco and what have you. And it's very much a living belief, you know. Indeed, the word Jinn is mentioned several dozen times in the Quran. Muhammad is said to have converted particular Jinn. So it's very much kind of a living belief in the Islamic world. Now, when you get to the Fae or fairies within Britain and Ireland, the belief, I guess, is probably most famously associated with Ireland, and that being kind of the Irish diaspora that went across the world around the kind of the mid 1800s to the present day, but in kind of the big migrations around the time of the famine in between 1845 and 1847, 48, and later migration waves. They brought a lot of that kind of folkloric beliefs with them, and a very prevalent belief would have been in the fairies. And we see that in kind of like some of those beliefs have survived into modern stories where you've got the term banshee, everybody is familiar with. And what banshee literally means is fairy woman. The word for woman being ban, and the word for fairy being she. So it's through kind of waves of migration and that the fairy traditions have survived beyond Ireland, and they certainly exist in Ireland to a degree today. Even kind of recently, I say recently, but it was like the 90s. There was a motorway that was being funded by the European Union in Ireland, and it was diverted to go around a fairy tree because essentially no workers would cut it down. I think it was in County Clare in the mid 90s, early 90s. So I guess my point is these are kind of living traditions, but there are the huge similarities between the two. But we'll get into that in the conversation.
Yeah, of course. And the next question that I would like to ask is, with the advent of something like Islamic tradition coming and being birthed out of an Arabic folklore system, we know that in Islam they have a view of demons, right? Where do jinn lie with something like that? How does the Islamic idea of demons, and I say it that way because in researching the Udug or the Utaku, as they say in the Akkadian, which are a form of entity that basically are almost this in-between creature that's, the Akkadians had a view of like creatures that were between man and angels, and then they had a view of creatures that were between man and demons, and this was the Utuku. And this is kind of the same idea with some of the jinn ideas that come from the Babylonian and come out into Islamic folklore. So I'm curious as to what, for the Muslim or for the Islamic world, what we would say the demon was.
It's a very good question. I mean, I've heard kind of a multiple kind of viewpoints on this. When I was in India shooting the story on the Jinn and the city of Delhi, I interviewed a Sufi caretaker / exorcist from a small Sufi shrine in Delhi's Ridge Forest, and he made the differentiation that people came to the shrine for exorcism from jinn, but also from evil spirits. So there was some kind of distinction there. Now, I couldn't tell you definitively what that distinction is, but he was adamant that they were two separate things. I think the important thing that we have to return to is the term kind of jinn and the term fairy. These are very much catch-all terms. So you could basically say like it's the equivalent of mammal or reptilian. They are very much catch-all terms. Yeah, I mean they're seen as separate entities from human beings. But this is where the kind of the folklore muddies the water quite a lot, because you have you have an idea of the fairies, or certainly the royal fairies, being fallen angels in Ireland, right? Right now, you have a similar kind of origin myth for the not the origin myth for the Jinn, but the origin myth for kind of Jinn's hatred for human beings. So starting with Islam, on the creation of Adam, Allah commanded the host to kneel down and bow to Adam. Now, there was a Jinn who was also in the host of angels, and now there is some sort of theological debate around this as to whether or not Iblis was an angel or a Jinn. Some people are very passionate about this, saying he was never an angel. The thinking, the kind of more conventional thinking, is that Iblis was a Jinn of note, of spectacular ability, and to that ability elevated him into the presence of Allah and the host of angels. Anyway, he refused to bow to Adam having free will, and basically saying, I will not bow to him. He is made of sounding clay and I am made of fire. I am better than him, essentially. And he refuses Allah's command. And this is where the kind of the tension or the schism kind of arises, where in further exchanges, Iblis says to Allah that I will beset your creation, on the road, and basically lead them away from your straight path, right? So you'll beset from the left and the right, from the front, from behind. He will attack them to lead them away from Allah. Now, this is where excuse me. This is where kind of like human beings are then kind of warned that they have an enemy. They have an enemy in the Jinn. Now, in the Irish tradition, there is a similar myth, a similar story, which is, and it's one of kind of several stories of kind of what fairies are, but it being that there is the battle in heaven, and the losing side are cast down from heaven to earth. The ones that were truly evil fall beneath the earth into hell, becoming demons. The ones who were not so evil fell just below the surface into the cairns and stone circles, becoming the fairies. Not evil enough for hell, but not holy enough for heaven, where they were there to wait for Judgment Day. And you get this, it comes up in the stories an awful lot, where somebody will be sent to the priest's house because somebody's been immediately stricken or stricken down suddenly with some disease, and the priest is called in the dead of night to come and give the last rites. But of course, this is some sort of fairy trick, and the priest is accosted on the road at night and kind of asked, when is Judgment Day? Can you release us from this bondage, and kind of intercede on our behalf and this kind of stuff. And then the priest obviously, no, you're damned. And that's it. So this is a huge similarity, and they've got this kind of like biblical reference in their origin. The actual kind of origin. Sorry, that's not the. I don't know what the actual origin, but another origin story would be the predecessing deities being kind of demoted from their kind of role as supreme being into a lesser being, and then kind of being demoted further into being fairy or Jinn. And that certainly seems to be the case with kind of like Jinn kings and fairy kings and that kind of thing. That it is essentially an Abrahamic a kind of a demotion in belief and status that is driven by kind of Abrahamic belief.
Yeah, I mean, there's a seeming connection between the idea of the Fae and kind of this, nearly a connection with, I'm going to say, the Dingir, or maybe even the Ijiji, with like Sumerian Akkadian belief systems. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as something like Anak. Well, I could say that the Tuatha De Danann are kind of like the Anaki, I guess, in some kind of way. But you know, I've heard that, you know, some fairy entities, you know, they're basically of the four elements, right? I mean, there's of the earth, wind, or air, fire, and water. I mean, that's a pretty common thing, right?
Yeah, it seems to be the type of classification.
That's a species, right? The air species, the wind, you know, the fires, you know, those are all species within this thing, like we said, Fae. And then there's the other ones, you know, that are this in between, like you were saying.
The issue we have is that everything is so muddy, you know, whereas, you know, if we look at kind of fairies in relation to the elements, you know, are they simply elementals? And the fairy being the catch-all term. There's a lot of argument to be said that some fairies were once human beings that may have been kind of worshipped over many generations from deep antiquity, and became a different kind of being as a result of that. There's also fairies who have never ever been human, you know. And then you get added areas of complexity where you have people who've had experiences of abductions, or in the folklore where they go to fairyland, or they're taken to a fairy kingdom or castle of some description, and there they see dead relatives, you know, in fairyland. So there's a huge kind of overlap in all these kind of categories. The really kind of it just, the whole thing is elusive of any particular categorization, which is very challenging for us because, you know, we love to categorize things. It's part of our nature. And you have very much the same thing within the world of the Jinn. I mean, the types of Jinn vary wildly, absolutely wildly, you know, in accordance to location, their nature. You know, some are famously, like the Naz are famously stupid, you know, and others are of extraordinary intellect, you know. And interesting to what you were talking about, these kind of in-between beings from the Arcadian belief systems. The Jinn are often associated with the inspiration of poetry, and our fairies are often associated with the inspiration of music. They're said to love music and musicians, so there is that kind of influence on human creativity, which brings us to the idea of daemons. You know, the Greek idea of daemons, where you have this kind of spirit that is external to the human being, but can influence them either positively or negatively. So yeah, it's. I think when we look at the similarity between these two, it kind of begs the question: are we just looking at two cultures describing a human experience, a human interaction with something else?
Yes, this seems to be part of the stories that I hear, even when I talk to individuals of maybe the Hispanic community, and they talk about creatures like the duende that seem very gnome-like in the storytelling. They're typically guardians of an area, guardians of a person, guardians of an item, and it's the human experiencing something that they don't really understand. Well, I mean, can we really quantify something that seems to be such a mystical, metaphysical property?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. As you pointed out, like, you know, these things seem to kind of repeat irrespective of where you are in the world. Like, to the creature you just described, like you have these kind of gnomish or dwarf type figures, like the Cornish miners, Cornish tin miners, the Welsh coal miners, you know, reported these things. I think one of them was called like a Tommy knocker. You know, they heard the knock in the depths of the mine. You know, it was the Tommy knockers warning them that there was going to be a cave collapse. You know, that kind of thing. So yeah, these things definitely seem to repeat. But kind of focusing on kind of the similarities between the fairy and the Jinn, like there's broad themes that are very similar, and then there's very specific things. So kind of, we started with the kind of broad origin stuff that kind of shares this kind of Abrahamic roots, but looking at kind of specific behavioral things, we mentioned inspiration and particularly kind of like artistic inspiration. But there's also kind of association with treasure, kind of guardianship of treasure. So you have the kind of famous leprechaun and his pot of gold. Now, the leprechaun actually is an interesting one because more traditionally it wouldn't have been seen as a fairy. It was actually kind of a type of diminutive slave to the god Lu. But there's an association with this gold and treasure. And the Jinn are famously associated with treasure and have been often kind of tasked by magicians to guard treasure, or they can be petitioned or summoned by magicians with the appropriate skill to indicate where treasure can be found. This kind of, you know, and there's lots of stories in Egypt that correlate to this, that people would be petitioning, evoking jinns to lead the individual to wealth. Now, again, you look at the fairy mythology and it's full of fairy folklore, and it's full of stories of the perils of fairy gold and fairy treasure, and you know the protagonist, the human protagonist, gets tricked to take away a bag of gold in exchange of something, and gets home to find out they've got a bag of dead feathers or something like that, you know, or dead leaves or other, you know. So stuff like that is common. The association with treasure is a common thing. There's also the association with flight, and we had the Jinn are said to travel in the wind, and we have a folkloric phenomenon in Ireland called the Giha Shi, or the Shi Giha, which is essentially means fairy wind. Now this would be like a miniature, you know, like hurricane, like a miniature funnel, like traveling across the land and whipping up stuff. You can go on YouTube. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, and you know, bearing in mind the dust devil would be seen as a Jinn. That's, you know, what that term would have originally related to. But you can go on YouTube now and you'll find videos that people have called the fairy wind from in Ireland, where this kind of, you know, strange, anomalous wind just whips through a field, whips through a garden. But if you were, say, you know, 80 years ago in Ireland, if you were touched by that wind, it was said you weren't long for this world, you know, and you were going to go. The other bit I would add to this is that both Jinn and fairies can have an amorous interest in human beings, which by all accounts is an absolute disaster when it happens. You know, that these beings do not do well with jealousy or indeed understand human condition. You know, and you get very similar with things like Yakshini spirits in India, which are kind of tree spirits. So yeah, it's remarkable. The Lana Shi would be a famous type of Irish fairy that would be considered as amorous and quite vampiric as well. In Robert Kirk's the Hidden Commonwealth, he talks about interviewing Highlanders who were essentially followed around by kind of amorous fairies, and and found the experience immensely distressing. Of course, havoc.
Yeah, there's all these tie-ins or similarities between both of these encounters or interactions with entities that we identify in, depending on our culture, what they are. One of the things that I thought was interesting is there's lots of stories within Irish folklore about being abducted by the Fae, or a child being abducted by a Fae and replaced with an something else that's similar, the changeling idea. But I'm curious as to if are there stories like that within with Arabic folklore of Jinn abducting people, and what's some of those stories?
Well, around abduction, I'm sure there are, but there are certainly stories of changelings, of people being kind of like part human, part Jinn. So remember, we talk about kind of amorous relationships between human beings and fairies, Jinn. So, you don't. I mean, I Dream of Jeannie. That's that TV show. That's what was going on there, right? Similar in the TV show American Gods, but probably one of the most famous kind of human being / Jinn relationships was that of King Solomon and Bilquis, or as she's better known, the Queen of Sheba. So, she is kind of a heavy hitter in that regard in terms of being particularly famous for it, but also kind of like Sargon of Akkad was said to say that his father was a Jinn. But yeah, King Solomon had heard of the Queen of Sheba and her great kingdom. She's described in the Bible as being a queen of the East. So modern scholars believe she came from either the kingdom of Axiom in Ethiopia or the kingdom of Saba in Yemen, or both. The main clue to this is that she brought bales of incense with her, or frankincense. And it only grows in these two areas, so both countries claim her as theirs. So he heard of her and her great kingdom, and he also heard she had a strange feature, is that a left foot that was cloven like that of a goat and a hairy leg. And this, so apparently this rumor was started by the Jinn enslaved to Solomon via the talismanic ring given to him by the angel Gabriel. So this ring was said to be engraved with the most high name of God, and with that ring he could command the Jinn. So the Jinn under his control, they feared the couple would marry and produce an heir which would continue their slavery, so they tried to separate them. But anyway, to see if the story was true, Solomon has the king of his court polished until it's like glass. And when the Queen of Sheba walked across the floor raising her dress, Solomon sees the reflection of her cloven foot, and right before his eyes becomes normal. And in another version, it's not her foot is cloven, but her legs are exceptionally hairy. But anyway, they have a child, and 7 years later she dies. And Solomon had her buried in the Syrian city of Palmyra, and according to legend, the Jinn are said to have constructed this city on the orders of Solomon. So the Kurds are actually said to be the descendants of the Solomon's Jinn servants. Yeah.
Within the Fae, I hear that they I had spoken to somebody, and it's the reason why we use things like iron bars, iron, etc., is the Fae can't. They're basically, violently allergic to iron for some reason.
Well, it's certainly iron and steel are absolutely seen as kind of as wards against the Jinn. excuse me. Indeed, the shrine that I mentioned earlier in Delhi had an iron chain hanging outside the entrance, and that was one of the kind of tools of diagnosis to determine whether somebody had a Jinn possession or indeed an evil spirit possession, that they couldn't pass the threshold into the sacred area of the grave, and they could not hold the iron chain
Right. Okay.
outside the doorway into the shrine.
There's some bearing to that tradition. So, what?
Yakshinis as well in India, they abhor iron.
The what?
The Yakshini.
So another entity, an Indian version of a similar.
Yeah,
Huh.
they abhor iron as well.
Yeah, I haven't found that in, like I had mentioned the duende for Hispanic. I haven't found anything similar in indigenous peoples of America's beliefs and their folklore that is similar to an iron or steel. But I am curious if there is, because it seems that there seems to be similarities between.
Yeah, there does. I mean, I think there's also kind of, whether or not, societies had metallurgy as well. That has an impact there. But like there's a number of like folkloric beliefs related to fairies around blacksmiths, for example, where it was believed blacksmiths could break fairy spells, essentially with their hammer and anvil. But there's I guess there's some kind of reverence or kind of mysticism around the kind of the skill of the blacksmith, because you had things like there's a prayer of protection in Ireland called it's either called the Cry of the Deer or the Breastplate of St. Patrick, and it basically kind of it lists out kind of potential methods of an individual could suffer an attack, and kind of implores the protection of God and St. Patrick. But in one line, it says something along the lines of like, protect us from spirits, women, and smiths. And by women, essentially, it means witches, essentially. Another translation says witches, and one translation says women, which is
sometimes that might be helpful.
Yes, it's a bit unfair. But in relation to smiths, it's talking about the blacksmith. So, in some sort of interesting taboo there around blacksmiths. I mean, maybe it's got to do with the kind of the output, the weaponry or whatever. But there's certainly kind of an idea of like blacksmiths possess some sort of otherworldly power
to either bind or loose.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That would be the difference between breaking or making a spell. Mm-hmm. That would be something interesting to consider.
Yeah. And like sometimes the blacksmith could drive away the devil, that kind of thing.
Within the Jinn and within the Fae, do you know how these entities could relate to, say, the broader supernatural realm? Are we confusing maybe a cryptid for a Fae or a Jinn, for example?
It's entirely possible. I mean, these are very much catch-all terms, So, there are certainly there's certainly kind of numerous types of Jinn within Arabic lore, and there are indeed the same within fairy lore. But like if you look at it this way, there's 5 major categories of Jinn. You've got Jan, Jinn, Shaitan, Ifrit, and Marid. Right, so Jan is a collective term referring to the masses of Jinn of all types, sometimes interchangeable with Jinn. Jinn is more used to refer to specific individuals of families, of tribes, of these fire spirits. Jinn are broadly seen as they can be good, they can be ambiguous, but Shaitans are where we get the word Satan from, and they are the children of the king devil Iblis, and they're always evil. Ifrits are more powerful than shaitans and are also seen as evil. Marids are also evil, and are said to be the most powerful of all. So they're the broad categories, but within that you've got a Karine, which is said to be the accompanying spirit, right? That accompanies the human being throughout their life. You kind of the Greek daemon and Christian guardian angel, and the Irish Ki Vimaha would be very similar ideas. You have then what else can we have? Yeah, the ghoul, from when we kind of get our ideas of kind of like, the monster, the ghoul, the Ifrit, which I mentioned earlier, and then the Marid are kind of seen like the behemoth, or the Leviathan would be seen as examples of the Marid. The Naz are a literal half person.
Literally a half of a person.
Yeah.
Yep. Exactly.
Vertical half person.
One arm, one leg, half a face.
Exactly that. The Silat are what you would kind of recognize as being a centaur. Similar like that. There's some theory that that Mongolian warriors riding their horses with such an expert level made them look that they couldn't fathom that these were actually separate beings, And then you've got a thing like a Vitala, which is, you would say kind of similar to what we would understand a vampire type creature.
Which would make sense because once again, these are birthed out of the same place that we get entities like Lamashtu and others that are, Lamashtu specifically went after your child in the crib. And so, it might have been a way, it could have been a way for them to explain, sudden infant death syndrome, and, SIDS or something,
Well, yeah, there was a particular, type of a Karina, which is different from the Karine, but a Karina was like a female child bed demon, right? So, and this seems to relate to Lilith in some descriptions. It seems to be kind of like a descendant of Lilith. So Lilith first appeared as kind of Lilu, a kind of wind or storm demon in Sumer about 4000 BC, and she was the bride of Samiel, the angel of death, the demon king. The story around Lilith is that in the Kabbalistic legends, like Lilith is the first sexual partner of Adam. During their attempted union, she refuses to lie below Adam, essentially saying, "I'm the superior one." And she's rejected by Adam, and she came to hate humankind because she's consumed as a kind of a jealous rage that she didn't get her chance to be the mother of the human race. So she hates all human beings, particularly children, and she's the deadly enemy of all women, especially new mothers, in her jealous fury. So that's kind of a more of a Jewish view of things, but it definitely ties into this Karina type figure, where lots of problems that could arise for newborn babies and new mothers were generally attributed to Karina, and lots of kind of talismans and kind of protective spells were said during this vulnerable time.
To fend off the Lamashtu, they'd put up a Pazuzu, for example, which is kind of an interesting thing because the Pazuzu becomes the demon of the exorcist, right? When it was considered a guardian entity, by the Sumerians.
Yeah, totally. It's a storm god, So yeah, but I suppose this sometimes you see
Correct.
this thing of protecting from an entity by using a bigger, scarier entity.
Something like the gargoyle or something on Gothic cathedrals, etc. So, why do you think there's such a big resurgence of interest in the Fae, or even in the Jinn and modern spirituality, as it relates to?
I mean, in all honesty, I think it's because there's a resurgence in enchantment more broadly. You know, that we're kind of enchantment is returning to the world. If you were to ask me my most kind of woo out there view of it, I think, you know, I think that's part of it. I think we've gone through a period of time and a number of centuries where we've had a very Cartesian worldview, and generally, when people had these unexplainable experiences, they were mocked and shamed because of them, and, you know, and they couldn't explain them. And these are experiences that don't stand up to, you know, empirical scrutiny. You know, and therefore became kind of things that were ridiculed and what have you. But people have still been having them. People have been having the most, you know, bizarre, incredible experiences, irrespective of kind of the advances or quote unquote, you know, modernity. I mean, you only have to look back to the Victorian era when kind of like the rationality and kind of you know, the kind of the jewel of the crown of the kind of the British Empire was these great scientific progressions and scientific exploration, you know, and of rationality and empiricism. While at the same time you had Victorian London being terrorized by Spring Heel Jack, you know,
or the dog,
Black Shuck.
Black Shuck.
Yeah. Which incidentally you get in Jinn lore. Jinn are associated with black dogs, as are fairies.
Right. Yeah, there's a big taboo about having a dog and being a Muslim. Well, you've done. I was going to use the word convention, and I'm not sure if that's the right word when it comes to, like, the what was it? The Gin and Tonic, right? What are some of the main key or main takeaways from a convention like that you've looked into, since this is your place of interest with the Spirit Box podcast?
Well, kind of broadly, kind of looking at it in terms of the widest themes being folklore, mythology, and magic around, or in the Jinn, and really helping frame that this is a deeply kind of ancient idea, you know, with lore stretching back into antiquity. But equally, it's alive and well in terms of belief in the Jinn, and indeed people who work actively with the Jinn in magical capacity. There's a huge body of work around it. You know, things like possession by Jinn. You know, an awful lot of modern belief in that. There's a real kind of strata of variance in kind of the different levels of the types of possession. I mean, I suppose a similar thing would be kind of an idea of like the Christian idea of obsession versus possession. You know, like in terms of interaction with the other, like these are your kind of broad terms for how this can affect people. But like Magzub is one who came too close to Allah and lost their mind, so kind of a god crazy. Malbus is possessed by one or more jinns. Maz al-Shaitan is the touch of the devil, so that might be kind of a lighter form of spirit possession. So you think of I think like in Ireland, like you'd have a term like away with the fairies. You know, say if someone was a bit like, but you use the expression touched. You know,
Yeah.
you use
Touched by the fairies.
yeah. Lambs is Jinn's touch, so it's an affliction caused by jinns that is less severe than possession, because the jinn is not permanently within the human body. It enters and leaves according to its own wishes. And then labs is basically a state where the jinn permanently resides in the human body and will not leave unless it's done by force. Yeah. Correct.
And do you have these spirit possessions of individuals by Fae folk? I mean, is that a thing?
I'm not overly familiar with any cases of possession by Fae folk like that. It may be just a different type of language. Certainly, like I said, you had expressions like away with the fairies, abduction by fairies, that kind of thing, but not per se. Certainly, people can be tormented by the fairies and driven to insanity. That's sort of a thing.
Yeah, there's usually an interesting correlation between the activities of like the Fae and then the modern idea of the alien, right? The extraterrestrial. And
there's certainly some crossover there.
The lights, the fairy lights, and then the orbs. I mean, there's these things that seem to be this kind of thing, and then there are other things that, like you said, a jinn can oppress a person, a jinn can possess a person. An entity that is supposed to be of smokeless fire and is kind of a thing of, an entity of shadows, basically, as opposed to something that's purely metaphysical and spiritual. And then there's a lot of these, but they can, a jinn can physically manifest itself, and
as a fairy can.
Right. And so once again, as we go back to like the beginning where we're talking about, are we talking about something that's the same but in different cultures? And then at the same time, it's like there's things that the jinn do that the Fae don't do, or maybe excuse me, the Fae are not or have done, but it's a language barrier, a language issue, because it's something, maybe in some old Gaelic story or something,
Yeah, perhaps, there could very well be, and like, I think if you look at kind of some of the old Irish stories, where you have things like, excuse me, like the idea of these kind of fairy palaces, like they always seem to be kind of like subterranean or within somewhere, and I think you could probably equate that to being inside, what people experience as being inside crafts when they're abducted. They're strange places. Sounds like a very obvious thing to say, but there were kind of like similarities there, and like at their most fundamental level, you'd be brought somewhere other. Excuse me. But when we think about the similarities here, one kind of example that I like to give is that if you recall some of kind of like John Keel's research into the Men in Black, the accounts were often given that they behaved in a very strange way. Like, well, one of the kind of factors that jumped out for me is that their clothes seem to be out of date, right? But not by centuries, but by decades. So they just seemed weird in that sense. It was like noticeable. The cars that they would turn up were, old 1950s Cadillacs, that kind of thing. But I was looking at this idea and thinking, well, how does that correlate to fairy? And you get the similar thing with these accounts of like the banshee and the banshee being perceived. Like the banshee isn't wearing jeans. She's not wearing modern clothing. She's wearing more kind of like just generationally. Oh my god, I can't speak. clothing that seems to be kind of more 100 years before, or what have you. It's like these kind of like quintessential Irish peasantry wear, But thinking about this, and essentially, if you're a being that isn't human and you're manifesting, what kind of concept would you have of fashion? Equally, if you're a being that lives for centuries, perhaps millennia, what's the difference between the fashion between decades, let alone years? So they're both exhibiting kind of like a very like surface understanding of human culture. And I think that's a similarity.
Yeah, there's the story of Indrid Cold. That's a pretty common one. Indrid Cold is wrapped up into the Men in Black mythology, but instead of wearing all black, it's usually depicted as wearing colors that are like bright and jarring, like, I don't know, mixing a bright orange shirt with bright blue pants. I mean, who's going to do that? Well, Indrid Cold does, because he's an entity that doesn't belong, right? Yeah. And then what was the other? Oh, Black-Eyed Children. The Black-Eyed Children seem to have similarities with the Fae stories.
Yeah, I mean, there were stories of Black-Eyed Children in Morocco, and that these were associated with this idea of kind of like Jinn hybridism, that the children of kind of like these trysts between human beings and the Jinn.
Which is really interesting and kind of oddening, because here, in the States, Black-Eyed Children or Children of the Corn, I guess, would be a horror film, I guess. But I mean, it's like they just pop up and they are really creepy and super creepy because their faces, they look like children, but they have like no soul. I mean, when you look at their faces, they're just not animate, and that's kind of an interesting peculiarity with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, what are you working? Are you working on anything new?
Well, my book launch is next month. My book's been out since early August. It's called Song of the Dark Man, Father of Witches, Lord of the Crossroads. And that is an exploration into the figure of the Dark Man as he appears in Irish mythology and folklore, and kind of overlaying that to the experiences of historic and modern witches.
Yeah, and different people like, what was that jazz player? Robert Johnson, was it? Yeah. And his experience is probably a black man experience. Fantastic. Well, yeah, if you're going to get it tuned anywhere, right? Might as well. Cool. Is there anything you'd like? I mean, anything else on this topic that you just want to?
Well, I suppose kind of thematically, when we look at these overlaps, I think the thing to recall is if we think about them this way, they're both tricksters. They're powerful, but they have limits. They're unpredictable. They can lie and be vindictive. They can shapeshift. They have invisibility, incredible speed and strength. They have influence over our internal world. They cast the evil eye, and they are capable of possession and abduction. So there's huge overlap with these entities, and they vary from being fairly kind of unambiguous and unassuming to being royal level spirits of immense power. So there's huge similarities really between them to finish.
Fantastic. And where can people find you? We mentioned your book. That's going to be available on Amazon.
Yeah, it's up there, available now on Amazon, and I host the Spirit Box podcast. Find me on Instagram, Darragh Mason. And yeah, that's it really. Or just Google Darragh Mason, you'll find my website.
Well, thank you very much for coming back on the show and talking to me a little bit more in depth on the Jinn and the Fae.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.